Thank you, John. Actually, yeah, that takes me back to that paper. I think it's one of the most underrated papers. No one knows about this, I'm sure. It's a great little paper from back then. Thanks, everyone. It's good to see that the room is full. I was really, really worried. You know, the Friday slot is usually for the PhD student session because everyone else is nursing their hangover. Been there. So, you know, good to see that there's a lot of people here. I just watched the slides around the history of CAiSE, and you know, it makes you feel proud, doesn't it? I mean, it's a wonderful community for 30 years. That's a long time, even in our business. And I don't go back 30 years, but I go back 15 years. So that's pretty good. I looked up. My first conferences was in Porto. Actually, it wasn't CAiSE. It was the MSAT workshop. This another very proud tradition of IS engineers. This wonderful little workshop. Then now a conference. And that was before the digital age. So if you actually wanted to read the paper, you have to get the book. I still have it somewhere on my shelf, so I looked it up. And that was my very first paper that I presented. Although that's technically not quite correct, because the very first paper I had to present was on behalf of some colleagues of mine. And they went to this workshop on philosophical foundations of information system engineering. So here I am, 20-something, first-year PhD student. I'm getting stuck into this workshop where there's all these very seasoned philosophers debating about and grappling about really important issues, and they stuck me in there to deliver a paper that I had absolutely no clue about. So, yeah, that was my first CAiSE experience. But it's great, right? We were sitting there last night and the previous nights, and we're thinking of how important that conference has been, especially over the early formative stages of your career, where you try to say, what am I doing? What is my field? What is my community? And I think IS engineering has always been my community. Independent of what you hear or what people say, I think I'm an IS engineer, and I think I'm a proud IS engineer. I study IS engineering, I do IS engineering, and I think it's a wonderful time to be an engineer. You know, now, as opposed to over the last 20, 30 years, now everything is in place. So for the last 20, 30 years, people have been grappling with, you know, who are we? What are we doing? What is our field? How do we differentiate ourselves? So I looked up some of these references that do this. And the striking thing is, okay, they position themselves. So here are the software engineers, here are the business people, we're somewhere there. And the labels that we attribute to ourselves, we're always sort of diminishing. We're soft, right? So we're applied. They all have these sort of negative connotations that we don't really belong there. And that was like a narrative you've seen for at least 2 decades. And it spawned too many things. I don't think that's true anymore. You know, where's our artifacts? What is it? What are we studying? Is it relevant? Are we rigorous? Where are we sitting? You know, does our research mean anything? The most striking thing about all these debates, they were always coming from our own field. Yeah, I call it a little man ego syndrome. So it's sort of like we didn't even trust ourselves that our own research is good enough. Yeah, but the good thing is, you know, none of that is active anymore. All these debates are passé. Why is that? Of course, digitalization is here. You know, you can't do anything these days, be it milking cows or doing other stuff, without using the word digital. When we moved back to Germany, it was around the New Year's break, and there was a New Year's speech, and the chancellor used the word digitalization around 35 times in a 5-minute speech. That's pretty good, right? No one knows what that means, but you know, we have a phenomenon where right now no one has to justify their own existence anymore as an academic in IS or in IS engineering. Clearly, we have digital things everywhere, and you know, clearly they have been engineered, and someone has to do that. We have digital natives, apparently, you know, so babies that are better with iPads than with anything else. And you know, we had this wonderful introduction to the digital government and digital citizens that we have right here in Estonia. I thought that was marvelous, especially after migrating back to Germany and having to do the paper-based version of all this. So, you know, we have a phenomenon that right now everyone is talking about. That's great, right? So we don't have any existence problems anymore. And we have methodologies, right? So engineering is research. We have to put that debate to raise, you know, 10 years ago, say. Well, I don't care whether you like design science or not. The point here is, you know, we have established methodologies, and no one would say engineering doesn't have a place in the sciences. Well, that's great, right? Wonderful. And look at this. A paper on meta-models in MIS Quarterly. Isn't that great? I mean, in 2017, there's meta-models finally in the top journal of our field. Wow, that's awesome, right? There's a study on meta-models in 3D printers, but what's really striking here, if you look up who these guys are, Haris and Gaurav, the marketing people. You know, the professors and the PhD student in marketing, and Jeff is more in matters of cognitive design psychology. So as engineers, not really. So, but they're taking our topics, right, and they're putting them up there in the top field. So, and that's the thing that we have at the moment. Everyone is doing the digital. Digital objects are at the attention of everyone, not just system engineers. That's great, right? But it's also very troublesome, because isn't that what we are doing? You know, our own rebuilding information systems and digital technology and these sorts of things. I mean, we've been fighting very hard over 2-3 decades of establishing this, and now everybody else is doing that. So at my own university, we have a department on digital aging, digital marketing, digital everything. The only people that don't seem to be on that bandwagon are ourselves. So I don't think that's very good. So when I think about keynotes that I liked over the years, I always like the ones that are a little bit provocative and tell people, you know, that's not good enough, something else. So I'm going to tell you, well, I don't like what we're doing. I think we got to do something different, right? So I'm not here to like big picture. I'm just going to say, well, I think we got to change a little bit. Hopefully, you agree. So, and I also did a little bit of homework. I wanted to review all the CAiSE papers and see how they you know, moved with the digital debate and this sort of phenomenon. I realized there were too many papers. So we settled on the most cited papers over all these years. So that's part of our data that we looked at, and we looked at, well, do they talk about the digital, whatever that is? Do they talk about digital objects? And this is how often digital is being mentioned in these papers. And yeah, well, see that? Right there, that's the dawn of the digital age in CAiSE. And it sort of fits, right? That's sort of when that whole nomenclature was being brought into any field, around 2010, 2011. So I was thinking, great, so we keep up with the times. We're also building digital objects and digital systems. You know, we're right in the middle of the debate. But then I had a look at that. And we looked at all the papers that mentioned that were digital, and most of them mentioned the ACM Digital Library as a source of the papers, of the papers they cited. There were other stuff, right? So they made reference to some networks and communities that had the word, like the area network. Of course, there were papers that were building this argument of, you know, some kids are digital natives and others are not. Or they used the word digital to differentiate, you know, so basically offline from online. Digital signatures from signatures, patient records from patient records, newspapers on the iPad from newspaper in, you know, in paper format. So that's really all the engagement that we've really had over the last 10 years with the digital. Everyone else seems to think it's something different, something unique, something novel, something disruptive. We think it's something online. And that's a problem. One of the key problems is that it goes back to this black and white thinking about what these things are. So digital natives are something different from digital immigrants. A digital something is the opposite of an offline thing. And I don't think that really helps us. And you see this in all these words and conversations that we have around this topic. Digital natives versus immigrant, digital transformation versus no digital transformation. The disruption, you know, where the all black now becomes white. Digital aid 1, 2, 3, 4, and any other words. All of them are characterized by so this dialect of the old and the new, the black and the white. The only thing we do know about these things, none of them are true. So if you really carefully look into the digital native ideas and these theories, to be very frank, it's rubbish. You know, the only serious studies on this matter show there is nothing different around digital natives and how they engage with technologies from any other generation. You know, the brain wiring doesn't change in a matter of a decade. Yeah, so, and you see this sort of demystification of something is very, very popular everywhere. A very good example, I think, is Christensen's idea of disruptive innovation through digital technologies. You know, it's incredibly popular. It's a well-cited theory, but all the studies that have ever been done on this shown it's wrong. You know, and there were lots of debates around this, and you can follow lots of blogs and arguments on either side. The key point around this is something that I think applies to all of our communities, including this one. It's around, well, we got to be thinking very carefully when we take these words and apply them to what we're doing. You know, so if we call something digital, there's got to be something different. Otherwise, it's just a new word for IT. So we were studying IT, digital innovation and transformation, when they called it technology-enabled transformation. Before that, we called that organizational change, right? I mean, on some level, it's all the same. We just have new words for it. So I think that's a problem. If there is something unique and special about this fourth revolution, about the digital age, then we got to incorporate that somehow. If there's nothing special about it, well, then we don't have to jump on that bandwagon. So I thought we'll talk about three things here in IS engineering. So first of all, we need to find out, well, is there anything different about digital technology IS artifacts from whatever you think are common IS artifacts? If so, can we do the same sort of theories? Can we develop knowledge about them in the same way, or do we have to change that mode of knowledge generation as well? And then third, you know, if there's a positive answer to these questions, then obviously, well, how should we do this? So, you know, can we do this with the same approaches that we have at the moment? So I want to talk about these three things. And the first one is obviously, well, the word digital, if we apply that to the artifacts and the things that we're doing at the moment, that all hinges on the assumption that there's something different or unique about these artifacts. Because if not, then it really doesn't matter. Then it's an empty attribute, an empty word that we mean. And I mentioned this black and white differentiation that you see very often, where people think that, you know, there's computers on the one hand side, and there's people on the other hand side, and they're sort of fighting, right? I don't think that's true. So already 10 years ago, before the digital age, there were people saying, look, you can't really separate these two. It's impossible to look at work without a computer. It's impossible to look at the computer without looking at what people do with this, right? So they were challenging that we say, look, we can put one thing on the other, one side, and this is one of the data pieces they used in these works, right? So saying like, hey, look at this, how this person engages at work, and there's post-it notes and computer screen, the internet, and a scribbling notepad there, right? So it's all sort of becoming one, fairly entangled. The digital and the social sort of work together. And that was before anything of the digital advances that we've seen. That was before the iPhone, for one thing, right? And since then, I mean, look around. We see a lot of things out there that involve digital technology of sorts, and you can't characterize them either. I mean, what are these girls doing? Are they going shopping, or are they playing? Are they living in a digital world through their phones? It's really hard to say, right? And if you notice at the conference dinner last night, especially in the early stage where the wine wasn't consumed all that much yet, there were people sitting there and they were playing on their phones right next to one another, and I was thinking that they were probably texting one another rather than talking to one another. The key point here is not so much that we overly rely on phones, it's just that the question of what is it that they're doing is actually quite difficult to answer. It could be a girl's trip for shopping or not, right? And it gets more complicated. Yeah, some of you may have seen Pokemon or the big Pokemon wave when it came up. I was still in Australia, in Brisbane at the river, and there were all these people, like 1,000 people gathering at this very meaningless boardwalk. There was nothing there. And I was wondering, what are these people doing there? And then I realized that in Pokemon, in that game, there was a Pokestop, and some Pokemon was there. And they all gathered in the physical world to find that digital rat or whatever it is that they were looking for. So you have really weird physical, social manifestation of something that happens in a very virtual and a digital space. It's blended together. It's really weird. And I like this picture here. So there's these two kids and they're playing, I guess, tennis of sort, but I can't for the hell figure out whether they're playing real tennis or virtual tennis. And I don't know what that girl is looking at either. I mean, what's she following? Is she following the screen or is she following the players? So it's really enmeshed, the digital and the social. So this whole idea of you put that on one side, the social and the technical there, that doesn't seem to hold anymore. There's all this distinction that put things in black and white, the digital natives were the other ones. That doesn't seem to hold. It seems to be very close together, right? So that has lots of implications. Number one is you can't think of these digital artifacts of our system anymore as tools. Because you can look at tools as the hammer and you can apply attributes to them and you can build a hammer, you can study hammers, you can do this without looking at the people. I think looking at Pokemon without people using Pokemon is pretty meaningless these days, right? So that view of an artifact as a tool becomes pretty meaningless. What we have instead is that what things are, what the systems and artifacts are that we produced, what they mean, only unfolds when we see what people do with them, right? So a mobile phone as an artifact is pretty boring. If you look at what people do with these mobile phones while they walk about their lives, that's becoming more interesting. So there's things that people do, and there's stuff that happens on the artifacts together, and they're becoming somehow entwined, and it gets pretty complicated in what they're doing. And that's where the meaning of these things unfold, right? I'll get back to this in a second. But first we get there, I think there's a couple of questions that are really, really interesting from an ICE engineering perspective. If you look at the people that have looked at, well, what exactly makes a technology digital? When can we apply this attribute to the artifacts that we create and sort of differentiate them from all the artifacts we've had beforehand? They said it's basically two things. Number one is decoupling of information from the device that carries it. You decouple information from its embodiment. The classic example is the boarding pass, where we used to have paper-based boarding passes, right? And if you changed, let's say you had to go and get a new boarding pass printed out, right? So the actual information was a real thing on a real piece of paper. If you lost that paper, you had a problem. Then we had obviously digitalization happening, so the first version of that was an online copy of the boarding pass. But if you wanted to change it, you still had to go back into the original paper-based source and change that. Now we have completely digitalized boarding passes. You don't need the paper-based copy anymore. So from a modeling viewpoint, I find that very interesting. Which is the model here, and which is the reality? And who's representing what here? So that's a core question that ICE engineering, that this community, that everyone that looks at how do we model the data and information, the way we grapple with all the time, right? What are we representing in our information system? So we don't have an original physical source anymore. Everything is in the digital world because it doesn't matter whether you put it on paper or on a digital device anymore. So just to give you an idea of how significant that is, this question of what are we representing with our theory, we've been doing this as long as CAiSE exists. So we studied, just now we got this paper out, where we studied 1,022 papers, all dealing with the question of what's representing what. 1,022 papers published since 1989, so roughly just as old as CAiSE itself. Much of that stuff is actually happening here in this community. And the key question of, well, do we have a system that is representing something real or not? Yeah, so that's becoming very tricky. The other really interesting thing is that the semantics are decoupled from any embodiment that carries it out, right? So we have 3D printers where you don't have to change the artifact anymore, you change the meta model. Well, that's pretty cool, right? So you can change the meta model on a digital basis, and then some physical thing is really happening. So the 3D printer prints, in this case, 300 different whistles from one master file. That's very interesting as well. So these two things are different, right? I think these two things are different, and if you look at what these artifacts can do based on these two seemingly simple things, all sorts of capabilities emerge. You can couple them very late. They have this notion of procrastinated binding, where they, what they really do and what they really mean unfolds very, very late. We have footprinting, of course. We get all this trace data that we can use in our mining efforts and so forth. They have some sort of agencies. They can do some things on their own. They can talk to one another. So that's what makes digital technology interesting, if you have some of these things happening. What is really interesting to me is if you put these things together, it means that the meaning of a technology of one of these artifacts is not static anymore. They're not a thing that can do something. It can change. Like a Tesla car at the moment that you can drive, with like a classical car, but it has already embodied the capability through a software update to be able to drive by itself. The meaning of that car and anything associated with this car, like where are we going, what route are we picking, how aggressive are we driving, is not, that all changes once the car starts moving by itself. And the technology doesn't even change anymore. It's already right there, but it's fluid, it moves, it's evolutionary. It's not static anymore. And why is that important? Because that is one of the key reasons why a lot of things change here and the knowledge that we produce about this. I'll give you 3 examples of theory that you may or may not recognize as in IS engineering theory, but we use them all the time in IS engineering. You know the top left-hand side, technology acceptance model, right? Then there's variants of this, and there's diffusion of innovation, so that's quite relevant also to engineering, because we're building artifacts and then we study whether people adopt it. So whether or not they come from our community, we use them all the time. I know we do. I have yet to see one implementation evaluation of an IS artifact that an IS engineer builds where they do not capture data on perceived usefulness. So clearly there's an intent, and they've been very successful. But how do they apply anymore? So if you think about perceived ease of use, I can go to my Tesla car, and I can think, hey, how useful is this car? 5 out of 7. Ease of use is 4 out of 6. That's pretty good. How about tomorrow when they run a software update and it drives by itself? Does my 4 out of 6 and 5 out of 7 evaluation still hold? Is my intention to use that thing, wouldn't it change if I don't even drive it anymore? Right? So these theories are very static. And the things that we apply them now, they're very dynamic. They change. Right? I don't know. My evaluation of Pokemon Go changed a lot over the time as I played it and as it changed and how it mingled with my real world. So it's really difficult to apply this sorts of knowledge production modes here to apply this. That's one problem. So they're very static and the phenomena are very, very dynamic. The other problem, if you look very closely at these and some other theories, they all go back to this black and white, this separated focus. Empirical stream, actually most of the research is on the actor. What's my experience, my cognitive load when I look at a model, my attitude, my perceptions, me, right? It's all on the people. All of the artifact stuff is usually on system features. Performance, security, usefulness, accuracy, reliability, all these sorts of things, and they have a focus on the artifact. People here, artifact here, very little that brings it together. Right? And I just said, well, a lot of the things, what they are, you can only look at what they really mean to people and what they really mean to this world when you see them in action. Right? This information quality model doesn't tell me what we do with these systems. TAM doesn't tell me what the technology is about. These features don't tell me anything about technology. So what we need is something that can sort of map that, right? Where we can study what people do together with things in the actions, routines, and processes that they engage in. That's really where the meaning of some of the digital stuff unfolds, and that's how we know when the artifacts that we engineer, or the engineered artifacts that we study, what they really are. Well, what does it mean? It means that we got to change something from the way that we try to produce theories and think about these things. We can't think of them as artifacts in isolation anymore and apply attributes to them, such as the perceived usefulness of a model or of an implementation, etc. We got to go back from properties that a thing has to something that is more relational, like an affordance it may create to users. And you would have noticed this in the academic discourse, that some of these shifts have already taken place. So whereas we used to call system features just features or attributes or properties, we now talk about them as affordances. All right, so affordances where people try to do certain things with technology. So we try to bring these things better together, right? We go away from these variance models, like the TAM or the diffusion of innovation models, these things, and we have more temporal, more process-oriented theories, hopefully emerging. So that's a key move from asking, what is the system good at doing? How good is it? What can it do? What can I do with this? It's more the question is, what's happening when I put it to use? What's going on here? How do we do the things that we do, given that we involved and work with technologies all the time? And if you look at the sorts of models and the theories that we use to produce these knowledge, someone working, it means that we got to shift from that focus on the men, or focus on the women for that matter, focus on the actors, or focus on the artifacts, to the places where these two things come together in action, in context, of course. Right? So I'll give you an example for this. We've been studying people go into a dermatology clinic. or any other clinic for that matter. You go in, you check in with a receptionist, you go to the waiting room, you go to a nurse, register you somewhere in the system, you do a little scan, you see the doctor, etc. and so forth. Classical process, or classical routine, or classical workflow, whatever you want to call this. Very simple, 5 minutes. 5 minutes of a visit. This is some of the data. It's obviously a little bit more complicated. And then we applied the theories that the different communities use. So if you're into the people side of things, you could draw a social network graph of all the people involved. And they're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Fairly simple, right? So there's a patient, there's a nurse, there's the physician, and maybe a lab assistant, and that's basically it. In our BPM community, we would focus on the actions. We would look at, hey, what are all the different actions and the sequences and the relationship of all the actions? What happens first? What happens next? So that's not a pretty process mining graph, but it's the same thing. It's a bit more complicated, right? So there's like 20 different happening, right? So 6 people doing 20 different things to these patients when they come in. So obviously it's a bit more complicated. So we reached out and said, we asked our process mining colleagues and said, well, this is not all of it. This is too simple. There's more going on here. And we got the reply saying, well, yeah, but we try to take away the complexity. We try to make it a little bit more simple because these things get really massive. Yeah. Everyone that works with process mining and event logs and so on, we know they get these spaghetti nets. They're really, really hard to interpret. Therefore, a lot of our effort has been to strip away that complexity and then make it a little bit more simpler, more understandable, and so forth. Well, I think that's the wrong way to go about it, to be honest. If the real life is a mess, then our job is to deal with this, not to strip it away. So here's the same model. The only thing that we changed here is we looked at what the actors, the 6 people, are doing, performing their actions, involving different IS artifacts, software systems, like a check-in system, an Outlook calendar to check the appointment, a digital scanner for the first, skin scan that they do, and so forth, right? Look at this. This is 5 minutes of 20 actions by 5 people. It becomes a mess. But it's not just some mess. It's not chaotic mess. There's obviously patterns here. There's obviously structure here. That's the same thing where we look at, well, here's what people do with technologies while they're doing things. I have yet to see any of these things in any process mining or any other ways of generating theories about what's happening in the real world. We still separate either the people look at the people, the BPM people look at the artifact people look at one of the artifacts. No one puts these things together. That's really what's happening. I don't really know what that means either, right? But I'm pretty sure that's the way to go about this. If we want to find out what people do and what these technologies mean to our lives, we got to see them in action. And yes, it's complicated. It looks pretty messy to me, but there's ways of dealing with this rather than stripping it away. I'll give you one very, very simple example of how that changes a lot of things. We've done something like this in a completely innocuous example. We studied handoffs. You know what handoffs are, right? So there's a person that does some work and he hands over the work to someone else. Like the metaphor of a relay race. We see handoffs, especially in medicine, right? A nurse shifts her over and they hand over the work to the next incoming nurse. So if you look at all the literature on handoffs, it's automatically assumed that a person carries over the work to some other person. Same process, same thing, same data, person changes. Right? So we looked at using this model so that there's people doing things with technologies. When you look at it this way, it's completely striking. Of all the handoffs we've seen in a call center, 2% involved people handing over work to something else. 2%. 98% involved technologies and system handing over things to other things, to people or to other systems. So the systems we're talking in the backgrounds, and then transferring data, transferring the workflow to the next system, and so forth. People were completely out of the loops. So the notion of handoff is completely different. There's no handoff between people. There's handoff between technologies happening most of the time. And that's an example from the 90s. So we're not talking about robotics here. We're not talking about artificial intelligence. We're not talking about any sort of technology with agent does things themselves. It's very standard, good old information systems that people use while they carry out work. But you see how when we look at it in a slightly different way, a lot of our commonly held assumptions look very, very different. And that's one of the things we need to do more. really don't care what you want to call it, whether you want to call it social, material, digital, evolutionary process, hybrid theory, God knows, but definitely not just social or the technical. These are two different realms, these two different worlds. You can't study them by themselves anymore. And we better be placed in actually incorporating that more in the way that we produce knowledge ourselves. We can't study the engineering of artifacts without looking at the social side, and vice versa as well, right? So then the final question then relates to, well, how do we do that then, right? Methodology. So if we wanted to embark in some of these sorts of questions about, well, there's something different about the artifacts. They are different, they can change, they are evolutionary, which means that we need to study them in action, in context. How do we do this, right? And again, I think it's really interesting. These phenomena, with all the good things that come from this, that everyone is talking about digitalization, it means that this phenomenon transcends our own disciplinary boundaries. So the question of whether or not I'm an IS engineer, or indeed an IS person, or a computer scientist, or a social scientist, etc., is pretty meaningless because they're everywhere anyway, right? So, and I've told about this example that other communities are taking our topics and our words and our concepts and study them as well. Yeah, so the marketing people writing papers about meta models. So if you look at some of the things that we now have in this digital technology infused world, not all of them are engineering questions, right? So they are very complex socio-technical phenomena where these two things come together. We have artifacts that can change, they're becoming smart, whatever that means. There's very unforeseen, very hard to predict emergent behaviors, and of course there's a lot of trace data these things can generate, right? So a lot of things. So if you look at these, how many of them are truly engineering questions, or maybe some other questions, right? And that's why, again, you see an emerging discussion about saying, hey guys, we gotta work better together. I know this sort of interdisciplinarity argument has been made for many years, but I just want to re-highlight it again. The computer scientists need to work with the social scientists. The social scientists need to work with the computer scientists because either side is not well equipped to deal with the phenomena that we have anymore. That's a really nice article on this very topic. So what does it mean? It means that if we want to understand the digital, we have to study what people do, what they talk about, how they engineer, how they craft these things. You know, when they conceptualize it, when they model it, when they implement, when they prototype, when they develop, or otherwise work with digital objects. Sounds very simple, and again, over 30 years, I've not seen one study that does that. Not one. Yeah? I look forward to this one. For example, I've never seen, I don't know as anyone else, a very good ethnography of software developers. A good old, very classical social science paradigm like an ethnography where it basically means observation, where we go in and study developers while they do what they do. Where's that research? Yeah? Why haven't we done this? I mean, we have very clever algorithms that determine what we will see on the web, I don't know, who becomes the next president, and all these sorts of things. And no one studies the people that build these things and all the implications, the far-reaching ones that they have. I think that's a fascinating idea, and I wonder why we've never done that. It's the same thing. If you want to understand how some of these smart things come into action, well, we got to go where they're being incepted, right? So these are some images we took when we went to one of these hardware labs where people come together and build these things, right? Craft them. There was a workbench with lots of hammers so they can literally hammer them away and decompose them in a way and see how their innards work and whether or not they're robust. We got to go back to the shores and study how people engineer these things, using very traditional research methods. Why not, right? So I think IS engineering has to become more inviting to these types of things. This is not a question of the social scientists. It's a question of us bringing these people in or developing these skills ourselves and putting both of these things together, right? So we can do this. Because if we don't do this, the other disciplines will surely do this and do what we do. Right? So what does it mean for engineering approaches? Well, let's focus on things that take into account how they implicate what people do with them. So, we're not engineering artifacts. We are engineering or designing new ways of working, new action patterns that we see in reality. That means we probably want to co-design them with the people that actually end up using them. Yeah? This whole shift from actor to action is obviously very close to process centricity, to process thinking, etc. That's not surprising that I say that, it's my own background, but I think it's really useful, right? So we can study a lot what these things are that we build, how we should build them by seeing them in action or what they're meant to be doing. It's at the same time, it means that we need to move to watching things over time. Watching things over time. I know that's a very deep challenge for PhD students, longitudinal research. How the hell are you going to study something over 5 years if you have a 3-year program? I get that. But we're not all PhD students, but we have a lot of researchers that can actually do this. Why not study things over long periods of time to see how the meaning and what they are and how they change things, how that unfolds? Yep. And then less determinism and causality, more to possibility. It's more about what are the possible action spaces, what are the things that we could do now, rather than what are the things that definitely happen in this sequence. So these are things that we need to do. So that's what I think. So I think it's a wonderful time to be an IS engineer. Everything is in place. All the debates and quarrels about where we are, who we've been, where we come from, whether we have a place in these scholarly communities in the wider scheme of things, all that is done and dusted. You know, we better move on and saying, yes, we have a great place. So this is the best time to be an IS academic or an IS engineer, for that matter, that we've ever been. When I started, no one was hiring. Now we don't find enough people for the jobs. That's crazy, right? So it's wonderful, everything is in place, but we can't hide anymore. That's the downside. A very opportune timing for the type of research that we do. And you can already see that all the other fields, or our neighboring colleagues from other fields, they're all doing and they're jumping on this. And we may laugh at the way that they look at the artifacts that they study, and then they're not doing it right. Well, they're doing it, we're not doing it, right? So we can't hide. We can't hide behind the challenges of old. We can't hide behind the debates of old. They've all been pretty much resolved. We got to step forward and be a lot more proactive and forthcoming, saying we are the prime people to study the digitalization area. We've been studying engineering for 30 years of these artifacts. We know exactly how they come into being, right? Turn to us. Right, so I think this wonderful paper about meta models, which is a really nice paper, by the way, I think it's a shame that it comes from a marketing department. You know? I think it should be our job to write that paper, and also write that paper that ends up in their marketing journal. That's what we should be doing. Yeah? That's all. Very short. Yes, we do.
Hello,
Yes.
I'm Ons from Sorbonne University. Thank you for your presentation, but I have like a question and a comment at the same time. I think like one of the great things about our master, I'm a master student, is the fact that we have engineer students, but also people that come from a business background, and there's a great exchange between us because of that. So I don't think that it's a shame that business people write about
No,
IS engineering.
Yes.
On the opposite, I think it brings an added value because it brings a different view.
All right, no, you're right. You know, it's very simple. You got to say, you're right. I'd rather see it this way than not having that, right? So I'm stoked that we have this. It's way better than 10 years ago. We had neither, right? Neither here nor there. So it's great. I just fear a little bit that it gets a little bit imbalanced. That, you know, we will see more and more of these things. And I don't yet see how we are doing this and how we are jumping out of our own community, our own circle of where we feel good, and you know, try to reach out to their community. So that's all I'm saying. But you're absolutely right. So there's a lot more mingling of these different communities, and especially the young on the young front. So that is only good. It's much better than what we had before. So yes, you're right.
Yeah, and you know about this issue. when I travel around Europe, I bump into a lot of Europeans who just hate the idea that they've got to take the kind of work that they really want to do and make it fit into American journals, into basket of 8 kinds of journals. There was one very smart guy I was talking to a few months ago who said, we did something related to conceptual modeling or something else, I forget exactly what it was, but we had to pretend that we used design science research in order to get it published. And so we have institutions, you know, you're the editor-in-chief of one of the journals. We have these institutions which you don't actually, you're not the problem. The journal that you run is not the problem. But what's going to happen that's going to allow us to do this kind of research, publish it in the places that our universities are requiring that we publish it?
Well, I think, to be honest, Steve, I think that's one of these quarrels of all that I think we just got to put to rest. So a few things on this. Number one, we do see these papers. You know, you do publish modeling in these basket or any other journals. We see that. We've seen this for at least a decade, if not longer, right? So I don't think that argument holds anymore. Is it difficult? Yes, of course it is. You know, so does it take 4 years, and is that a good thing? No, it's not. But you know, that's a very different debate. So the other thing, I think it will naturally go away, and here's why. I think these journals and these baskets and that community, the people that formed it, were not coming out of that own community, right? So these were, it's 40 years old. That means the people that invented this, so to speak, they're still alive, but they're slowly dying out. Yeah, and these were people that came from either engineering or the marketing or any other sort of school, and they invented this, what we now call IS. But they're not natives either. They're immigrants, right? And so they modeled these disciplinary structures in the journals institution based on whatever reference they came from. But that's 40 years ago. I mean, some of these people sadly have passed away by now, you know, and the other ones are retiring, are retirees, etc. And like me, I mean, my undergrad was in information systems. Not in business, you know, not in IT, in information systems. There were study modes already, so, and I'm not that young anymore, right? So there are the generations that we have now and that are looking to fill these shoes of the old, you know, taking up these editor positions for one thing. There are information systems people coming out of information systems, not some other field. So I think, number one, it'll slowly go away because we have more people that come out of our own community just by generational change. And the second thing, well, we want to change something, you're not happy with this? Well, go and take up some of these positions and do something about it. Yeah, so you're right, it's very hard to change this institution, but at the top of these institutions, there's still people. And if you want to change what a journal does, well, get involved with that journal. Right, so that's what I mean, no more hiding, go step up and do something. And you can, because the generational change is in full swing. We have lots of, at all the conferences, we now have retirements of the good old professors. And now they're looking for the younger generations to step up and fill the shoes. Simple. So it's a good time to change.
Back here?
Yes.
We also saw that they are dying. But then she suddenly said, probably it will never change because they created their PhD students schooled in the same way.
Yeah.
It will take a place and it will never die.
Yeah.
So I don't think you can change it. The only thing you can do is create another basket. It's not used for institutional purposes, not for ranking, not for performance measurement of individual and institution.
All right.
You cannot change this journal probably.
I know it's, I'm probably optimistic about it, more optimistic than you, right? So I think we can. I really do. So, but I'll tell you one other thing, that a lot of people that are in these positions, so I'm, you know, as I said, I am an IS engineer, whether you believe it or not. I do this and I study this, etc. and so forth. And I am one of these editors on one of these journals. You know how many IS engineering papers I get? None. You know, next to none. So here we are. I mean, like, you can publish this work. Obviously, people can publish this work, and I'm not saying it's easy. One of the problems that I see, I don't get any of these papers. Very, very, very little of them. So that argument is sort of tinged for me because there's a lot of complaining, but not a lot of action. So Shirley is right. And the problem of the young scholars following obviously the things they've been taught by their own mentors and advisors, yes. Right? So if they continue with all the old ways, then nothing's going to change. I'm just saying it can, because we have these generation change, and we look at this, we're producing scholars and scholars and scholars. Who was it? Selman, did you have like 20 master students coming to CAiSE this year? Yeah, I mean, how wonderful is that? I mean, and so what's the message we're teaching them? Oh my God, publishing in the journals is hard? Is that the message you want to say? I don't think it is, right? So I think it's a wonderful time to do this, and it's a great time to try something different and move forward with this, right? And to step up. I think we need to step up. I really didn't see this coming that we're having this discussion. So I've been an editor at MIS Quarterly for the last 4 years, and I handled around 50 papers. Right? You know, not every paper obviously, but 50. I think I had one modeling paper in that stretch. I had everything else, you know, paper that I had absolutely no idea about. But I had one modeling paper. Jeff Parsons, who left, he's been SE, and so he had around 80 papers. He said he had 2. You know, we're deep in the core of this community, always have been. And we get 3 papers out of a few thousand. I mean,
do you know why? Because people tried and was rejected.
Of course.
They don't send once more.
So you're saying that we're too scared? Yes, I mean, all I'm saying is I think that there is more place in good work. I remember when people said you cannot publish in these journals. Well, you can. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying it's easy, but you know, you can have the same discussion when you're in IS strategy. These people don't get their papers in all the time either. So I don't think there's any particularly difficult for us just because we're engineers. If at all, things have been better, because whether you like design science or not, whether or not there is a lot of things that have gone wrong ever since that was written, it's a very established methodology, design engineering. We can do these things. People accept it. Right. Marcello, please help.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. If it is the best time to be an IS engineer, why do you think that the community is shrinking? Or at least there is this big feeling that the community is shrinking and that we are not growing as fast as other communities are, like machine learning or AI.
Well, I think there's certainly a sexiness to it, right? Machine learning, AI, I mean, big data. And you know, in a way, there's a good idea to jump on the digital bandwagon, because that creates sort of, everyone's talking about this, so you want to be associated with this phenomenon that everyone's interested in. We go back to the institution. I think that is an institutional problem. So we had a lot of discussion this when we were PhD students, so around this 2005 and 6. You know, CAiSE was the monument that we wanted to climb upon. We were absolutely elated to get into CAiSE. Now, our students don't submit there, right, on their ranking list, and it's not, you don't get points for their PhD and you know, so forth. So that's one of these problems with overemphasis on ranking lists, etc., that has also been coming up over the last 10, 15 years at the same time, right? So that is a problem. I don't know what to say. I mean, it was easier then, and it was nicer then, because you know, I remember being incredibly happy about getting a case paper accepted. And as you said, you're not dating anymore. It is a big problem. It's also, we have too many conferences, I think, on workshops and outlets, and at the same time we have very, very, very big pushes on these rankings and points and God knows what else, and it obviously moves away from looking at a paper and seeing whether it's a good paper or not. That's a very different question. So that is a problem, and that's one that's affecting us. And I think the only thing what we can do is sort of what I'm saying is we need to reach out, because if we stay close, we're probably going to die out, right? So if we get less and less people attracting for reasons that we can't really control ourselves, say our deans don't accept these papers and so forth, right? The only way we can do is we got to open up and invite other people in, because we can't sustain ourselves. I mean, we have, what, 200, 300 people? It means a large group anymore, right? So that is a problem, and one that we're not fully in control of. That's right.
So Marcello stole my words to some extent, but I'd really like to hear your opinion, because, yeah, I was also thinking about the shrinkage of this community, and I think it to some extent, it is our fault. Because we always have these debates in program board meetings about how to, where to draw the line and what's in our scope and what's out of our scope. And I'm afraid that we need to adjust. And we need to try and rethink our scope and our boundaries and see how we can be more relevant for the AI and data science and all this digitalization revolution or whatever. So I'd like to hear your opinion about this.
Well, I agree, and that's not unique to this community. There's other of this community of similar size and focus that are also struggling, right? But I think that is a problem. We got to do something about it. I'm not sure, right? So there's little things. Maybe moving away from Springer proceedings to allow people to take that paper that they presented at CAiSE and submitting it elsewhere. I'm not sure. Maybe that helps. Maybe inviting keynotes from very different fields rather than our own people to sort of get that communication happening. Not sure. I think one thing we can definitely do is act with a little bit more confidence. So if you go back, so as I said, our starting class, we went through all the 30 years. I didn't end up analyzing all of them, but I looked at all of them. So that was really cool. There's a lot of great papers that led a really big mark in the wider fields that come out of this very community over the 30 years. Yeah? So we don't advertise that very well. We're very humble and modest, and that's a great thing, right? But in this day and age, maybe we got to step forward and say, we are the IS engineering community, and this is some of the exemplar work that we've been doing over these 30 years. So for example, the 25th anniversary book, I thought that was a great idea. You know, but the sad part is only we know about this, because it's one of the gazillion Springer books that's out there, right? So, but you know, we can advertise a lot more. We've had superstars, we had super papers, we've led a really big hallmark. And you know, this is IS, I mean, for one thing. If we don't study how we build these systems and what they do and what they are, right? So we are deep in the core. We're not a niche. We're not an outlier. We're right in the heart of it, but we don't act like this, I don't think. So maybe that's something we can do. Step up at some of the other events and the bigger events and saying, you know what, who we are, we're the engineers. You should come to us, because we've been doing great work for 30 years and counting. That's a very different message that we could take.
Jan, wonderful talk. Thank you very much. I know that in your career you have also been working in industry. And I found it also interesting that many of the papers that you cite also reflect on the things which live in popular tradition, which really make an impact on how people look at things. You mentioned Christensen with his disruptive theory, and I like that you emphasize how rubbish that is. My question, and a little bit moving away from this discussion on these academic journals, my question is what you think really has an impact on real life and how to perhaps make that impact other than through these academic publications. What is your opinion on that?
My opinion on that is that we're actually pretty decent at that. So I'm drawing on some BPM example because that's my probably facet of the engineering community that I know best. But you know, these guys that are sitting here, I mean, the building systems and study them and evaluate them, etc., and they're being put into use. I mean, the roundtable, Marcello talked about the process mining at Suncorp. I mean, it's right there. So you don't get that paper in MIS Quarterly because there's no theory and blah, but that is relevant right there, and these are engineered artifacts, systematically, well done, well evaluated, and well put into use. So I think we're doing this really, really well, and much better than many or all of the other communities. Lots of our engineered artifacts, we put into place. We've always done this. Back in the days, we've had this, demonstrative case study somewhere where we showed how it could work, and maybe we do more stringent evaluations these days, where we have to do that anyways, right? In all of these journals, all the engineering things we have to test, right? So I think we're doing really, really well. Again, maybe we don't advertise it very well. And no, we haven't invented Uber or Facebook for that matter, but who cares? I mean, we have lots and lots of very good tools that companies use, and for one thing, save millions and gazillions of dollars, or do other things. So I think we're doing really well. It's just that obviously that doesn't show up on my academic CV or on yours either, not really, right? So That's a problem. And I don't think we need to write a paper on that either. Why do we need to write a paper on something that we've done that was really relevant and really helped someone? They know it. So.
Hi, thanks. Massimo. I have a very provocative question and I want to know your opinion. In your opinion, should we go towards a model, as many other communities, in which you have one big conference that publish journals paper every 3 months, accepting something like that, 1,000 people getting there? Basically what you said, and if you take the list of your paper, there is BPM, ICSOC, ER, CAiSE. Basically, we have scattered ourselves over a lot of conferences. What is your opinion about getting back to a big event, 1,000, like EJKI or ICSE or WellDB, and then having a big impact?
Well, to be honest, two parts to this. So number one, I think there's a very good place for the workshops and conferences of exactly this size. So you come here, it's a single or dual stream event, right? So you see every paper. You go to the big events, there's 17 streams in parallel. I mean, you get to see next to nothing. So I don't think that's the move. There's many of them, right? In ICE, they're not even big. I mean, I have never been, but a management conference, 15,000 people going. I mean, you don't even meet anyone because it's so many people. I don't think that's a good way to go, right? So I've always liked these single stream, 200 people. I mean, over the course of 4 days, you get to talk to everyone and you get to see all the papers. I think that's way more developmental. Having said that, I think some of the example you drew on from some of the software engineering, computer science, I think they're very interesting formats here. So is it VLDB that does that? This sort of, you can submit all year long until a certain point and the papers are accepted. That's what we'll have at the conference. But there's no deadline per se. There's like a proceedings journal instead of a book or something. I think these are interesting modes. I'm not very familiar with them, but you know, why not? Surely there's something else than a book. I'm not saying, I'm not sure that's the answer, but I would definitely explore this, yeah.
In that model, what they achieve is that they have the rankings. That is a problem that you raised. So in that case, so if I understand your vision would be, yes, let's have a kind of journal model that allows to have high rankings, but let's keep manageable dimension conference in which people can really speak.
Yeah, maybe that is a compromise where we satisfy our institutions and deans and ranking lists. Just one thing that I think is really interesting, the EMISA workshop, that's like a German community. I think a couple of years ago they changed to, at the conference you can submit a paper that is a recently published journal paper. So you go to the conference and present, hey, this is the study, you know, I would just want to draw attention to it. I think that's a great idea. You know, and you have it and they have at least one session or one stream, whatever, on these are really cool, good papers, full-blown, mature papers, and I'll come in and give you the 15-minute version of it. I think that's great, right? Having said that, I haven't actually been, but you know, I think the model is great. So there's a variety of models that we can try. I mean, it's a digital world. On some level, we don't actually have to gather here, right? I mean, we could do all sorts of things. You have ResearchGate, you can publish all these papers somewhere. Why do we need proceedings? They're everywhere anyway, you know, so.
At the beginning of your talk, you sort of said, well, this stuff about rigor versus relevance and so on and so forth, that's kind of old stuff and kind of boring. One of the things I notice in a lot of the papers I review is a complete lack of rigor in terms, and especially in defining what the domain is that's being discussed, and especially in providing several examples that are good examples. So, in this community, I don't think that's a problem. I mean, really, you know, like we're doing, here's a model, it's a model of X, or it's a general approach to X, and usually it's pretty clear what the domain is. But I wonder if you just have any further comments about that issue.
Well, so the rigor versus relevance debate, what I meant to say is that the debate of rigor versus relevance. You know, is there problems of rigor? Yeah, of course, right? So yes, I see that all the time, especially in, you know, theorizing sort of papers that they don't do a very good job at that. But what does that mean? It just means that we're not very good at that yet, or some people are not very good at that yet, and we need to, you know, train and become better at it. That's all it means. It's the same with people doing formalism. They'll probably make errors and learn some more and get better at it. That's all I think. I think one nice thing here is that we have a nomenclature that is pretty well established. We don't have to write a definition of what a model is because we all think we know what that is and so forth. So that's what I think. It's just not very good work, and we all need to train all the time to get better at what we do. It's a hard thing, yeah. So we never count the rejections, really, do we? I mean, they say a lot about what we do.
I'm just wondering, there's this traditional problem in information systems research that it's difficult to come up with theories which are both expressive and which have a good level of confirmation. Now, given, as you demonstrated, that the level of dynamics is increasing as well, what are, in your opinion, the prospects of actually coming up with theories which are, well, which have a good degree of empirical confirmation and which at the same time have a good level of expressiveness?
That's a tough question. So I will say this whole notion of developing theory and sort of testing it to see what the attributes of the theory are, I think that is actually becoming a lot easier. Yeah. So only 10 years ago, when I did my study involved empirical work, I had handed out paper-based survey, questionnaires, things. And now we have this big data problem. I mean, getting data to validate or to test or evaluate our artifacts and our theories is a lot easier now that we have these traces everywhere. What it introduces all sorts of new challenges, right? So big data problems, big sample problems, and so forth. But on the whole, it's a lot easier. At the same time, we demand it more and more. So a theory evaluation or artifact evaluations, people expect more. Put it bluntly, you can't publish a paper without a good evaluation anymore. So is that how we do this and what sort of quality criteria we apply to these things. That's, again, it's like anything else. I think it's a moving target. So there is an expectation for precision in algorithms, I guess. And there's moving targets for, if you do empirical evaluation, whether or not you can confirm or disconfirm your hypothesis, etc. I mean, I only think it means you stay on the ball, right? You look for the new textbooks as they come out and what they say, how we should do things, etc. So it's tricky, but I don't think it has changed fundamentally. It's the same challenge we've always had, but I don't think so. I don't think the challenge is any different. It was hard, and it remains hard, and will remain hard. I think that's a very fluffy answer to your question, but it's probably the best I can give.
Thank you. I want to go back to the shrinking of the community problem, and I want to go back to of the source, and talk about the programs that we're teaching to the master and undergraduate students. I come from an engineering background. I did 5 years of engineering in information systems, and in these 5 years, the only thing that I thought about the teaching in my school is that this is not what I want to do after. Because I saw that there is a huge gap between the evolution of the information systems today and also the boundaries. Since now we're talking about blockchain and Internet of Things, and we are fascinated about that, but we don't see it in the teachings. So don't you think that there is a gap between the evolution of IS and the evolution of...
And how we teach it?
Yeah.
So I think the blockchain is really interesting. I think there's more experts on the blockchain in these rooms here than all the ones that I see in the media, right? So I'm not sure anyone can be an expert on this thing yet because it's a bit tricky and it's been pretty recent, etc. But I think, if at all, anyway, the papers here, they go much deeper into things than anything I've seen in the newspapers and in public panels and God knows where else, right? So everyone is an expert now, but it seems like no one really is. So that's what it is. For the teaching side of things, yes, I guess. So some of the old systems development textbooks, I think they need a revamp, right? So I think we need to write more. But then again, I see teaching modes where we teach systems engineering by having students build these things, right? In sort of agile settings, in capstone projects, etc. That's very different from 10 years ago where we had an overhead projector and taught it on a slide. So I think we are doing more of this. Whether we're fast enough in adapting what we teach, I think there's still a good place for fundamentals, right? So I've been teaching systems development this year, and try to tell them why we had methodologies come up in the first place. And you look at, you know, they don't get it. They're too young and too far away from the 70s to understand that. I mean, that's crazy, I think. So I think there's a place for both, right? I do think that there is a good opportunity for people to write a new systems development textbook. Marcello, you want to do that too? No. So there's room for innovation in teaching, but I think it's been happening as well. I don't know how far-reaching, why, but I've seen some pretty cool different ways of going about it, rather than just some guy talking about and reading from a textbook. I don't think we do that very much anymore, I hope.
I will first use the microphone to make an announcement, and there will be a related question, and there is a follow-up question, is closely related. I would like to remind to all the authors that we offer, of the conference papers, that we offer the opportunity to submit a link to the author's copy of the paper, supplementary material, data sets, link to prototype, whatever you want, multiple links if you and slides. And the related question is reproducibility and data sharing, which I think is really something we have not been doing very well in this community. You know a little bit better the IS management community. Is there something that we should be doing more or better? I know in software engineering conference they have introduced this concept of the artifact committee, you know, that you can accompany a paper with an artifact. Could be a software artifact, for example, and or could be an experiment, you know, an experimental pipeline where, you know, you have all the elements to reproduce to some data, some experiment from start to end, and there's a committee that checks it and then says, puts the stamp, yes, verified artifact. So what are your thoughts?
I think this community is doing much better than you say. Right, so I think it's pretty good compared to the wider IS field. So, you know, you have demo tracks. Again, in the BPM, that example of the BPI challenge where there's large shared data sets, and most of the evaluation of the artifacts are in direct comparison on the same data sets happening at the moment. So I think that's great, and I think that's something that IS management, the empirical guys, whatever, they're not doing that yet. So some of the things they are doing is they open up dedicated journals on such things. So they have a journal on replication research. We can only submit replications. But if you do, and if it, you know, and they basically accept all of them because very little reason usually to reject these papers. So that's great, I think. And it's a great teaching tool, by the way, too. They share, or at least they provide, you can share the data, you can share the instruments, you know, your protocols or whatever. You can share the code. And if your paper gets replicated, so wherever it is originally published, you get a badge. You know, and you can accumulate badges over time. Again, I think in general it's an institutional problem again. I mean, we have digital journals, like my own journal is entirely digital. There's no paper copy of it. But what do? We upload PDFs. I mean, you can upload everything, right? I mean, we could upload all the data. We could upload all the artifacts, all the code, everything. But no one seems to be doing that, right? And to be frank, we don't offer that either. So, but we could, right? So, I mean, we could do a lot more in this regard. I think it's better than everything we've ever had to. I think there will, if we do more of these things, data sharing, we find out that we have a lot of more replication crises like they show in other fields. I would be very surprised if that's not the same here. But again, I think the engineering community does reasonably well with the demo tracks and the shared data sets and these gold standards for evaluation. I think that's great. I mean, in this paper that I said we put in December, we actually said we should be doing something like this in the modeling community, right? I'll give you my experiments, you give me yours. You know, the models that I use and the questions that I use and tasks that I use and the coding schemas or whatever it is, there's nothing like that yet. Why not? You know, we're all doing the same thing. So I think that's great. I think we need to do more, as do the other fields. And I think there's some good moves. I like the replication journal. The institutional problem is, of course, it's on no one's ranking list. You know, but I've seen great ways of doing this. I know there's a introduction to a research course on a master's level where over the course of that semester, they do a replication and submit it to that journal. So I think it's a wonderful scientific teaching tool. You don't have to worry about theory or about research design. You copy someone else's, But you can, you study and you learn the mechanics on how to do this. In these cases, especially empirical work, how to run a survey or whatever else, and you can publish that. I think that's great. What a wonderful way to teach science to people where they don't have to worry with some of the other elements that are challenging, and learn it, get a paper out of it, and the original paper gets better for it, for that matter. So we can do something like this, right? We can do a repository, a public one with all our artifacts, all our code, all of our data. Why not?
Okay. I guess we all exhausted the questions. Room for one more? No? Okay, so thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.
I understand that this is handpicked to help you with your gardening process. I'm not sure of the need of that, but we'll find out.
That's very helpful given my gardening skills. So thank you. Thank you, Joe.